Welcome back. Today we're going to start a three-part video series that's going to cover the creation of particle systems. The first one we're going to do is going to be a rain, splash, and fog system that you see in this particular scene right here. We're going to do one on a snow scene. We're going to create some snow particles, and we're also going to do one that deals with fire. We'll do fire embers coming up out of the fire. We'll do some smoke. And then we're also going to deal with how to make lights flash like a firewood. If you're trying to simulate the lighting of a fire, the crackling of a fire, how would we do that? Now this one, which is the one I'm going to start out with, I'm going to go ahead and click the play button up here just so you know this has some additional features built into it. We're going to be doing something that looks exactly like this, but we're not going to complete it until you get into the audio section, which is I think week 13. Or week 12, we're going to go back and we're going to add some sound and some lighting into it, so you get something that looks like this. And it's got the sound of rain coming down. And we also have flashing lights and some thunder sounds added to it. And if you look closely at it, you'll see little raindrops come by the camera. And if you look down on the ground, you'll see that there's little splashes that are appearing on the ground. And we're going to show you how to do both of those. In terms of the materials that you see in here, I'm going to let you read the handout that goes along with this week's assignments that talks about how to go in and make a material look wet and shiny. That's what helps sell this particular scene. Obviously, if I had rain coming down on dry ground, it would look kind of odd. So I went back in and I created some custom materials. I used the basic textures that were already in Unreal, and I copied them into a new folder, and I made some new textures so I would have the ability to make things look wet. And you can go and read those and see exactly how that's done. But that's what you see in here. That's why the walls are shiny and the ground is shiny and everything's kind of all set up. So let me escape from that. And what I'm going to do is, and it also talks in there about how to darken your scene so you end up with something that looks a little bit more like this. Now I am going to talk about that sky dome that you see up there. I'm going to show you how to bring a sky dome in and add it in, because I've replaced the sky sphere that's up there with this custom sky dome. It looks really nice. So it kind of completes the scene as far as I'm concerned. It should look like it's, you know, cloudy and overcast and gray and dark in this particular case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in here and let me remove my particle systems that I've got that are in here. I've got the raindrops. Now, one of the things about particle systems is that when we're creating a particle system, it is extremely memory intensive. We're dealing with a lot of particles, hundreds of thousands of rain particles, and then I've got additional tens of thousands of splashes appearing on the ground. And one of the things that you might be aware of is that when movies are being filmed, they don't always, obviously, they don't film on wet nights. They like to have some control. They don't want cameras out on a wet night filming a scene where they have to make sure that the equipment doesn't get wet. What they do is they do carefully controlled rain sequences, and they set up sprinklers, and they only have it rain where it needs to rain. And part of that is because right now I have a particle system in here that's raining over this entire area. The problem that you normally deal with in a situation like this is the human eye can't see raindrops very well. I've got it selected so I'm seeing the little particles that are coming down out of the sky. But it looks like they're all clustered right here in front of me. In actuality, they're raining throughout this entire environment. And if I zoom up and out and look at this thing, you see all of the rain. If I go up too high, pull that back down. If I go up high like this, they start to disappear. You really can't see all those raindrops coming down. The human eye can't see them, and it can't really project them in the game. So if I go in here and come back in and go back down again, it looks like these are all maybe right in front of me, but there's really particles that are coming down way off in the distance over here. And the same thing is true in real life. In a movie, they'll set up a rain sequence, and it rains right where the actors are. And the actors might have an umbrella and they're standing in the rain, but the camera's dry and everybody else is dry because it's only raining where they are. The appearance makes it look like it's raining everywhere. As humans, that's what we tend to think is happening because we know how rain behaves. If it's raining on those people standing 10 feet in front of me, it must be raining on me. So as long as they look like they're getting wet, and as long as they look like they're standing in the rain, then the entire environment must be in the rain. So ideally, we set up particle systems and attach them to the players. And I'm going to show you that in a later video. Right now, this is a focus on how to create particle systems, so we're going to create one that covers this entire area. If you're dealing with a little bit older computer, you might have a little bit of a problem with this. But you can make a smaller environment. The importance of this is to see the rain coming down, to understand how to make the particle system, to understand how to make the splashes occur, to understand how to make the fog. There's a bank of fog that's in here. Understand how that happens is the important thing. So you can always scale it down to fit the stuff that you're trying to do. But just so you know, I'm going to be making a bigger one here, and then later on I'll show you a different way to do it. Now, if I deselect that, then I don't have that load going on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to delete. I think what I'll do here is let me save this level here. Let me stop for a second. I'm going to save this. I'm going to come back. All right, I've saved this file under a different name, so I have it. So let me make sure that I'm in that. Save that. All right, so I'm doing the same thing. I'm going to go in and I'm going to start removing my particle system. So there's my raindrops. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take that out. Okay. That looks pretty good. Okay. If I turn that dome off, you'll notice if you don't have a sky dome, if you set the fog settings the way I have it in the handout, this is kind of what you would end up with, but the dome just kind of brings it all to life just a little bit more. All right. Other than that, it's a basic scene. There are a couple of other elements. I do have a sound element, and I do have a lightning over here. Let's go ahead and take the lightnings out so I don't have them in here. And I'll take the rain sound out so I don't have that in here. And that just kind of gets me back to, I'm just dealing with the base system. And you can see I've got some wet, shiny ground. If I go over and look at it, I have wet, shiny walls. It's hard to see in the darkness, but it works pretty well. And let's focus on actually making some particle systems. So usually what I do when I'm doing something like this, and in this particular case, you're going to need some elements. So what I have done is I have already downloaded them, and I'm going to go in and we'll talk about what they are. The first thing here is a droplet material. This is an image that I created that is going to become my raindrop. Not too worried about the color of that thing. That looks pretty bright. I'm going to be able to turn that down later on when I make my particle system and when I make the material for it. So just so you know, that'll all be set up. You're going to have to go in and you're going to have to get the raindrop. The other thing that you're going to want to get is there's something out there called a splash cone. Where is it? Splash cylinder. Right here. And if I'm looking for my FBX file, where is it? Maybe that's it. Yeah. Okay. There is this little teeny tiny cone. This looks like an inverted Dixie cup or a regular Dixie cup, but it was something that was created in a 3D program. It was a cylinder. The top and the bottom were both removed. It was scaled down so it's really tiny, although you'll find in particles we can adjust things like crazy. I can make things bigger or smaller. I'm not really too worried about the size. But this one was made fairly small to start with. It has no top and no bottom. And then it was scaled so the top is a little bit wider. And then there actually is on this thing this nice splash-looking material, which interestingly enough comes from the old Unreal Engine. It comes from Unreal 3. And it's called Green Splat. And I have provided that for you. And it looks like this. Okay, and this was literally, they had in the old system, they had a gun that fired these green droplets at you, and they would hit and they would splat. And it turns out that texture is just about perfect for what we need to have, because it kind of looks like a raindrop hitting the ground. So what I did is I went back to the old Unreal Engine and I pulled that image out, and I don't want it to be green. So what we have done in here is I've gone in and created a material that uses not the green part in here, but uses the green plate. Now remember, an RGB image, which the red, green, and blue channels here represent the different elements that go together, are really black and white. When you combine red, green, and blue together and shine light through them, you get color. So the combination of the three of them makes that drop look green. So if I said, well, let's go ahead and use this one instead, I'm going to get a green splat, which is not kind of what I want, because I really don't want to do that. If I look at the blue plate, I'm going to get something that looks like this. It's just kind of a flattish gray. If I look at the red plate, I'm going to get something that, again, has some detail in it, but not as much detail as I'm going to get out of that green plate. This is going to give me a lot of the different colors and variations and shades on that one. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use that. I've also made it shiny, so it's reflective. And I've given it a little bit of an emissive color. And an emissive color in this particular case means it's going to glow just a little bit, because I want it to pick up the light in the environment. So I've added that into it. If you don't like that, you can always come back in here and you can break that link. And it's going to be just a little bit darker. And I'll leave that link broken just for the sake of this one, so I can separate it from my other one. But it is shiny and reflective, okay? And I've darkened it up just a little bit. Remember, if you go in and you multiply a texture by a color, by a value of 0 to 1, 0 is black. If I multiply this thing by black, I'm going to get black. If I multiply it by white, I'm going to get the color that I want. So in this particular case, I've added just a little bit of grayness to it, darkened it up just a little bit, and I think that that's going to work for me just fine for my splash. Now the handout covers the making of the materials. It covers importing. It tells you exactly what you need to import. I'm going to focus in this particular video, I'm going to focus on just making the particle system itself, because it can be a little complicated when you're setting it up. So you have it, and I'm going to, actually I've got one already. I'm going to double click on this one and bring it up, and then slide it off to the side over here, so I can go back and do some other things. Now, when we are creating a particle system, what we're going to do is we're going to go in here and we're going to select a new particle system. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call that one PS for particle system. And I'm going to call it Rain 2, just so I have it. And then I'm going to go ahead and double click and open it up. So I have a particle system all ready to go. And let's look at this window here about what's going on with the particle system. What exactly is this window, and what all is going on in here? Okay, the controls across the top I'll deal with as we need them. Most of the things that are up there we don't have to worry about. You can restart a simulation, you can restart a level if you want to do it that way. You can undo and redo. Thumbnail is going to become important. In this particular case, not as important, because you're not going to be able to actually see rain in this screen. This is your preview screen, this viewport. When we have rain coming down, they're really hard to see. And normally what we do is, and I think I have one down here for maybe my fire. You can see I've got a little picture of a fire down here. That's so I know what that fire looks like, or know exactly if I have multiple fires, whether it's the right color or the wrong color. Maybe I want a green fire as well. I can tell the difference, but it gives me a little visual down here. In this particular case, what that would do would be give me a visual on dots that are so tiny you'd never see them. So I'm not even going to bother doing that. I also have some LODs up here. We'll talk about LODs. When I talk about creating a rain system and attaching it to a player, I'll show you a little bit more about LODs up and through here. I have the preview window called the viewport. I have a details window down over here. This is where we do most of our work. We have the emitters window over here. You can make this thing as big or as small as you want. You can rescale the little windows. I tend to keep it, I'm looking visually at this thing, so I need to see what I'm working on. I need to make my changes or revisions or additions are going to be handled down here in my details panel. The emitter up here is just going to show me the different elements that are in here, and if I click on things that are in here, what you'll see is it changes my details panel. So there are going to be things that I'm going to need to do, and there's a lot more elements that we can click on and add in that I'm going to be doing to make changes to this thing so it functions a little bit differently. And then the bottom right corner down here is the curve editor. We're not going to need the curve editor here for a while. We're not going to use it at all for this, but the curve editor, when we get into smoke, where we have things where we have to change, say, the color of an object over its lifetime. So maybe if I'm creating embers that are coming up out of a fire, maybe because they're emanating from the fire itself, they're going to be like a bright yellowish orange when they begin. But over the course of their lifetime, embers burn out. So they're going to change to a darker color as those little teeny tiny things burn out. I'm going to be using my curve editor down here to control how an object changes color during the course of its life. I'm also going to be changing opacity. As smoke starts out, smoke is heavier when it first forms, and then it gets wispy and disappears as it moves up in the air. I can also do opacity down there, so I can take care of that. Just so you know, I'm going to go ahead and close this little window. Just so you know that most of the changes that you can do down there in that curve editor, you're going to see we have the same ability to do that in the details panel. That's where I tend to do it a little bit. I think that curve editor can be it's an unnecessarily complicated way of doing it, and I usually keep it closed down there so I'm not dealing with it at all. Now you can rearrange things that are over here. Obviously you've got individual tabs. If you want to take your tabs and move it around, you can. This is kind of the format I have found works best for the things I'm doing, because I'm going to be adding stuff in here or changing things down over there. So first thing we need to do is, you'll notice you have particles coming up. They're coming from a source, they are spawning, and they are moving up. And if you look over here on the right, you will see I have a particle emitter. I've got some controls up over here. I can turn it off, I can turn it on. I can right click on this thing up here, and I can go to emitter and I can rename it, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to call it raindrops. It's good to keep these things named. In this particular case, I'm going to have two emitters in one. I'm going to have raindrops, and I'm going to have my splashes in here as well. When you're dealing with memory issues, remember, the more particles you put into a scene, the more complicated it is. Well, the same thing is true when you're dealing with emitters. And interestingly enough, two emitters within one. If this is one emitter for raindrops, I'm going to have a second emitter up here that does the splashes. The two of them in a single particle system takes up less memory than a particle system of rain and a particle system made up of splashes. And since the two of them go together anyway, we might as well keep them in the same particle system. There's only one thing I have to keep track of, and it's much easier to do it that way. So when you click on this object up over here, it also gives you the number right here, the 23. Keep in mind that the higher that number gets, the more elements are occurring and the more things the engine has to keep track of. And so as I go in and start making changes, what you're going to see is we're going to end up around 800 here for the raindrops. By the time I get through adding in everything down here, we're going to be dealing with quite a complex particle system. And then we're going to have splashes. It's going to be almost 500 more elements going on. So we'll keep that in mind. All right. Now, as we're working in here, you'll see that I'm actually going to be making a lot of changes in here. A lot of these things are standard. You're going to see Cascade is going to be at the bottom of every one of these things that are down over here. I'm going to close that up because I don't really care. I'm not making any changes. Most of the changes I made are going to be made actually to the maybe first one or two sections, or sometimes I'm down to a third section looking for it, but this one will work pretty well. All right, now, let's talk about these things over here. Number one, you'll notice there's a black bar right here. That's because we're going to add something into it here in just a second. But it always starts with required. And when you click on required, that's what it's going to ask you to get the basic elements that you need to have. Most of the time, it is a material. You create a material for a particle system, that's what's going to work for you. I'm doing when I start doing the splashes, I actually have a model, so I'm going to have something a little bit different going on, but I'm also going to have this black bar is going to be filled with something completely different. So that's where I'm going to be picking whether I'm using a model or using a texture. By default, you're using a texture. So the first thing you're going to be doing is you're going to say, well, I need to have a texture in here. So let me go and pull this thing out of the way, and let's look for my rain texture. So I have it. There's my rain droplet. This is my material that's been made. It's not a complicated material. It's a fairly simple one. Just so you know what is going on in here, I have my image. I'm multiplying it by 1, so I'm just getting a nice bright image out of that. If your raindrops are too bright, you can always take that and maybe turn that down, and it'll darken up your raindrops just a little bit. So it's not quite so bright, a little bit more gray there. This is the important one down here. This is a node that is going to allow me, if I so choose, to change the color in the particle system. Without that there, I would only have the ability to work with that particle droplet the way it was created and the way that it looks here in my material. So a lot of times we use this vertex color node in here. It doesn't have any bearing on the material right there. It doesn't do anything to change the way that material looks. Even though it is wired into the emissive color, and even though it's wired into multiply, this is a translucent material. That's translucent so I can make it have some opacity. But it's wired in there as an element just to give me some added controls in the particle system. Without that, I don't have color controls in the particle system. And that becomes really important when we start working on fire, because obviously I need to change colors of the fire, and without a vertex color node in there, I wouldn't be able to do it. But that's what that material looks like. Save that. Okay. I think I closed them both down. Droplet 2. I'm looking for my particle system down here, which I closed. PS rain 2. So there it is. Let's pull it back up over here. I'll save that. So what I need to do is I kind of pulled it over here because I'm going to go back and I'm going to make sure that my rain droplet is selected here, and then I'm going to come back over and I'm going to click that material right there. And now you see I have rain droplets and particle systems and a particle system that is going up. I'm not worried about that right now. I'm go ahead and save that in the background. I'm going to be changing a lot about the way that goes. There are some things over here we're going to talk about. And this is where we're going to come in. Now, besides adding the material in, there is another section here that you need to be aware of, and that's the screen alignment and the sort mode. We tend to change them in pairs. If we change one, we tend to change the other one. Okay. What this is these are, and I'll go up and I can change the view of this thing. Let's look at this as what do I want to look at? We'll go ahead and we'll look at this thing in wireframe. It's hard to see because it's red. You might not be able to see it, but there is a series of little red cards. It's a little red square with a diagonal line cut through it. This is a two-dimensional particle system. Go back to red on this one. The two-dimensional particle system. So what it's doing is it's creating what we call a card with the texture on it, and then it is moving the card up and away. The card has the thickness of a piece of paper. So it's not a real three-dimensional raindrop. It's not a real three-dimensional object. It's a flat card. And if I were to walk, if this was shooting up just the way it is now, those cards are all facing right straight ahead, right facing towards me. But if I were to take and move around the side, which it doesn't work in here because of the way the particle system works, but in real life, if I were to take that particle system and put it in my world and not make any particular changes, what you would see is you can walk around the side of a particle system and the particles would disappear. And that's what's being controlled right here. PSA square is those square shapes. If I click and hold on that, I've got rectangle, I have velocity, I have away from center, I have type specific, I have facing camera position. If I select facing camera position in this particular case, what it will do is it will always face the camera. And you have to remember the player is the camera. So he has a camera attached to him. If it's first person, which this game is, the camera is my head. If it's a third person, we have a different issue because the camera is behind the player. And so what happens is the camera can move around the player and do a 360 in third person, which you can't do in first person. So in first person, we can go ahead and set this to facing camera position. If I'm in third person, I'm going to leave that at square because it's based off the player at that point. It's going to point towards the player at all times at that one. So in this case, you can do either one. I'm just pointing out that PSA square is going to point towards the player. This one facing camera position will always face towards the camera. If you have a difference in the position of your camera and your player, you do need to know what's going on. And then you can change these down here. Basically, you'll see when we start dealing with other elements in here, what we can do is we can make objects disappear the further away they are from the camera. Or I can set fog so it disappears off in the distance because you can't see it anyway. It's just going to go dense. So I don't really need to worry about that. So these are a couple of other things that are in here. You also have the ability down over here to change something called the emitter loop. Now, this looks like it's turned off. All right, and this is one of the functions that you'll find in Unreal. Their numbering system, sometimes it's hard to turn something off. If you think 0 is off, and then you type in 0, it'll say then 0.000000009, which is virtually off if it's 9/10 millionths or whatever it's set to. I got to assume that that's pretty much off. That's as off as you're going to get. But 0 in the case of emitters stands for an infinite amount. So right now that particle system is emitting those particles forever. It'll do it forever. Right? If I go in and I say, let's set that to 1, it's going to do a burst and then it's going to stop. And it is resetting because that's what this little thing will do. But in the world, if I were to put that in, it would fire out one burst, and that would be it. So, and its emitter, the duration is 1 second. So its emitter is 1 second, and I can set variables if I wanted to do variables, but basically it's going to emit 1. If I set it to 0, that's an infinite amount. It's just going to run forever, and that's kind of what I want. I want it to rain forever until it doesn't rain anymore. Okay, so that's my required tab. There's some other elements that are down here that sometimes we get into them. Well, we'll be talking in here about sub-UVs. When we do flames, we'll talk about what sub-UVs are. But for right now, that's pretty much all we have to have in there. All right. Then I'm going to go to Spawn. And Spawn section deals with literally that. It's the objects and how many of them there are on the screen at any one time. Now, most of the elements that you see over here, you're going to have little windows that you have to open up. And you're going to see this complex system here. It's Spawn, it's the rate section, the distribution, and then the constant. What that is saying is, in this particular case, it is distribution float constant. That means we are doing a constant number of them. A float is a decimal-based number. When we start doing some more work in Blueprint, we'll get a little bit more into that. But if you remember, if you've done the Blueprint section, a float is a decimal-based number. So it would be 1.6, or this in this case is 20.0. But it's a constant amount. It's not varying. I'm not going in and setting a minimum or a maximum amount of particles. I am leaving it at a constant rate of 20 particles in this particular case. So what I'm going to want to do, however, is I need more particles than that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to say, let's give myself, let's say 1500. And so now I'm getting this giant burst of particles. It's coming out like that. Right now, down here under burst, it says particle burst method instant. You do have some other things that are in here. It'll do interpolated, but it's not really making any differences in there. I do have the ability to make some changes down here, but I'm not. I just want to let you know that that's what that is. And then the rate scale distribution here, it's coming out of one single spot. That's what I want. I don't want to go in and set that to maybe 5. And then it's going to, you can see it's doing these little, it's keeping everything as these little bursts. I don't want that. I want to keep this as a single burst of particles like that. Now it is looking kind of weird, but again, don't worry too much about that, because all we're doing, basically all I've done so far, is say that's the raindrop I want to use. I want to create 1,500 of them. So it's still trying to behave as if this was a steam or a smoke or a fire thing, and that's why it looks kind of like that. Now, the next section we're going to deal with is lifetime over here. And the lifetime deals with the life of the particle, how long it is on the screen. Now, in this particular case, it is set to a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 1. No two particles really should have the same life expectancy. The raindrops, when they're coming down, would all pretty much have the same life expectancy, but and sometimes you don't really want that. If you're dealing with snow, for example, some of the snow melts halfway down, and so it kind of disappears. And this is how we simulate that, by putting in a minimum and maximum lifetime. So some drops will live the full life cycle, some of them will disappear and fall off the screen, and that, which is, in the case of these little raindrops, is going to be just fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to control the life. I'm going to set a minimum of 0.2, and I'm going to set a maximum of 0.5. And this is based, is going to vary from particle system to particle system, depending upon what it is you're trying to do. It depends on how big it is. It depends on how high off the ground it is. A short life, if you've done the 2D particle class, when we did Game Maker, when we've done particle systems, if we have the life set to, if we set a life time high, so it has a long life, then it covers a much greater distance than something that has a very short life. It disappears. And it depends upon how high off the ground you place your rain system. A short lifespan on a system that starts 100 feet in the air, the drops are going to disappear before they ever reach the ground. So you kind of have to massage these numbers, you have to put it in your scene, you have to look at it, and you have to kind of work with it. I'm giving you numbers based upon this particular scene, the way I'm setting it up, and what's going to work just fine. The drops are going to move quickly. Rain comes down fairly quickly because of the weight of it. And a speed of 0.5, or a lifetime of anywhere between 0.2 and 0.5, is enough to make the rain come out of the sky, hit the ground, and die out. Or it passes through the ground, but it looks like it dies out. So we'll do that. And you're going to see we're going to have a lot of minimum and maximum values as we go through things, because that's what's so important. It's the randomness of what we're dealing with. Okay? The next thing we're going to deal with is the initial size. And this is why I said don't worry too much about the size of that. If you're creating something in Photoshop, don't worry too much about how big it is, because you have the ability to come in here and make it bigger or smaller depending upon what you want to do. So what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to open this all the way up, and you'll see you have minimum and maximum start sizes. The distribution, again, this is distribution vector uniform. Vector has to do with a point in space. So what this is going to do is determine the size of them as they are in space. And what I'm going to do is I have a maximum amount and I have a minimum amount. Now you can open up each of these things. They give you the X, Y, and Z settings on them. And I mentioned earlier that these things are really two-dimensional cards. There is no Z. So we're really only going to be dealing with X and Y's here for a while. We do have a couple of places where we do have Z. When we talk about velocity, we're going to be dealing with Z because they are moving up and down, which is the Z axis. But for right now, I don't need to worry about the Z, because this is going to handle the size of that particle card, of that picture, and I'm only really worried about X and Y. And what I want to do is I want to do a variable on this one too. I'm going to set the drops to be 10 for a maximum size, and then I'll do a minimum size, and I'll make them about 7. Usually I do about 2/3 or 3/4, somewhere in that range. And I'm not too worried about the Z. I'm going to set those to 0 because there is no Z. So I'm just going to set that to 0. And you can see my system now is, those drops are much smaller. Initial velocity. When we're dealing with initial velocity, obviously you've got that's important because this is what's controlling with the direction that the drops are going. So if I open up this start velocity right here, again, my distribution is vector because it's dealing with a place in space. All right. What it's doing is it's telling me that I have movement on the X at 10, on the Y at 10, and the Z at 100. I have minimum is moving at -10 on the X, -10 on the Y, and 50 on the Z. Now, the speed, if you remember back from GameMaker and the direction that we are talking about, when we go in the negatives, we are moving to the left. If we go into the positives, we are moving to the right. So the fact that I've got a cone coming out of here is because I've set the cone to be from 10. It's moving a degree over here, 10 degrees. And it's also moving at -10 degrees. So some of them are going this way, some of them are going that way, and the result is I get a cone. Some of them are moving upwards at a speed of 100. Some of them are only moving up at a speed of 50. So I guess why I'm getting that variation on this almost a flame-like look, but it isn't really a flame-like look. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go in and say, look, for right now I want my rain to come straight down. So I'm actually going to say 0 and 0 and 0 and 0. And now I'm going to get this basic cone going up like this. It's more like a lightsaber than anything else. But what I want to do is I want the speeds to be much faster, and I want them to go down. So if I put a minus in front of that number, my particles, some of them are going up, some of them are going down, and I'm going to go ahead and say, let's make this so some of them are going -5,000, and some of these are going to go -3,500. And where did they go? They went right down here. There they are. They are moving now downwards. So my rain is coming down at a speed of 5,000. And again, remember, the speed and the lifetime are linked. The numbers aren't linked, like physically linked, where if I change one, it changes the other. But remember that if you want to change how the rain is functioning, how long it is on the screen, that if you change the speed, you might have to go back and address the lifetime of it. If you want them to be, if they're disappearing too fast, you have to go back and maybe change the velocity. If you slow them down, they're going to cover less distance because they're going to die out quicker. So you'll have to adjust those two things together. Color over life. I'm not dealing with color over life. If I was, remember I've got that vector node in there in my material. If I wanted to change it, I can. In this particular case, I'm not going to change the color on that. I'm actually going to right click and I'm going to delete it because it's not making any difference at all. In this material, I'm not using it. I'm using the actual material color. Okay, now what's left for me to do in this particular case is I need to be able to go in and spread this thing out so it's not this needle point raindrops coming down. I need something that's a little bit more spread out. So I don't really have what I need in here to do that based upon these 5 elements. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to look at the other options that I have in here. And there are a lot of them. Most of them we're never going to get to. We are going to be working with collision ones. We are going to be working with location. We're going to be working with rotation. We're going to be working with size maybe. We're going to be working with sub-UVs. We're going to be working with type data. There are some things that we're going to be working with in here, but there are a lot of things we're not going to. So I'm just going to kind of focus on the things we do have to deal with. And what I'm going to be doing here is I need to have a location. I need to determine where these are going to go. So if I go over here and look at my location, you can see I've got a bunch of them. Initial location seed, world offset seed. Seed, by the way, means randomness. If you were working with, let's say, I had 2 rain particle systems in here. And I need them to be basically in 2 different positions. If I just use initial location, it's going to control everything. If I use seed, that gives me the ability to go back in, and every time it appears, it's going to appear randomly. So in this particular case, I just need to have an initial location. So the first one, it's the one we use the most. But if I wanted this thing to come out of a cylinder, I could select cylinder. If I wanted to come out of a sphere, I can select a sphere or a triangle. I got some different choices in here. And you'll see when we start doing the smoke and the fire, we're actually going to be using a cylinder to create the fire. But if I wanted to, I could actually, do it out of an initial location and do it that way too. But I'm going to select initial location. Doesn't really make any changes because I have to click on it here and I have to tell it what it is I would like it to do. Distribution vector uniform. So again, vector is dealing with an area. Now it's helpful to know how big your world is because I'm going to be making a particle system that covers my entire world. So that world, I kind of need to know how big it is. And if you are using the first or the third person world, I will tell you that that is about 4,500 units square, or maybe 4,000 units square. I want to make sure the rain covers that entire thing. So if you remember what we just did a second ago in terms of negative and positive numbers, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set this thing so it is 2,200 on the X and 2,200 on the Y. And I'm going to give it a height of about 500. Okay. Particles are coming down. You have to look really hard to see them, but they are coming down. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, that's 2,200 to the right. If I basically have created a large rectangle that's 2,200 by 2,200, what I want to do is I want to go back now and say I want to make this one minus 2,200 by minus 2,200. And I'm going to set the height of this one to maybe a minus 100. So what I've created is I've created a box that is 2,200 by 2,200 in one direction, minus 2,200 by minus 2,200 in the other direction. It starts 500 units high and goes to minus 100, so it's a total of 600 units. So it's 600 units high and it's 4,400 units square. And so the drops are hard to see, and that's kind of the way it goes. That's why I'm not going to bother doing a thumbnail, because the chances of you catching one little tiny dot and then being able to see one little tiny dot back over here is probably not going to be that good. So I'm not going to worry too much about it. Let's go ahead and save where we are at this point. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that rain system and I'm going to drag it out and I'm going to put it in my world, and I want to check to see how it's actually looking. So I'm going to drag it out and set it in. And if it's selected, you'll see the little particle cards, and you can kind of see where they are. And what I'll do is, this is where you want to use your other views. I'm going to go into my perspective, and I'm going to look at my top, and I want to see if I can see where it is. Sometimes you can't see them. You can go up here to show, and you can say use defaults, and sometimes it'll come in. Sometimes you can't see it. Let's try maybe looking at the left view. All right, I can see in the left view, there's my particle system. I'm going to pick it up, and I'm going to pull it up so it's up in the sky. And the particles are dying out down over and through here, but they're starting up kind of high. You want to be able to look up and see them coming down, so you don't want to start too close to the camera. I need to be able to see them coming down, but obviously rain comes down from way up on high, but I don't need to have particles in the scene that long. I want them to appear and then disappear. So I'll check my left view. Let's check my front view to make sure that I've got this thing centered in my world. And then I'll go back over here and let's go back to perspective. And I have rain coming down all over. And if I go in and play it, you'll see the drops coming by in front of you. You're looking for just a few of those little drops coming by. You kind of get a little bit of that effect. If you're not really happy with that, what you can do is you can come back over, and then if you really want to jack this thing up just to see what's happening, go back to spawn and maybe make that 5,000. And you'll notice it doesn't really show you much more there, but if I save that and then go back in and play it, you might end up seeing more of those little particles go by. They have a little bit of a glow to them, just a little bit, and you'll just see them. And that's kind of the way it is in real life. You don't really get a lot of rain. You don't really notice individual raindrops coming down, which is why I have that set really at only about 1,500. Okay. Now, one last thing I want to show you on this before I break it, and then we'll do the splash as a separate video to break this thing up just a little bit. I want to talk about the display of your particles on your screen. This is intensive, all right? Now, what is happening is the graphics card is having to generate those particles. And if you are fortunate enough to have a nice graphics card, if you've got a tower with a nice big, 4 or 8 gig graphics card, sweet. This is probably not causing you any problems. If you're working on a laptop and you've got a 6 gig graphics card like I have, sweet, it's not causing you much problem. If you're working on something that's got either a graphics adapter or has a really, really, really low video card in there, you're probably going to have trouble with this, and you might get a tremendous amount of lag off running these kinds of particles. So what the boys at UE4 and the girls at UE4 came up with was something that would enable your computer to create particles and to display them using a lighter load on your graphics card. So the graphics card here is creating them and generating them all you see. Once it creates the original particle system, much like assets, if I put an asset in the scene and I duplicate the asset, it's an exact copy of the original one. Unreal doesn't need to think about it. It only has to portray it. It's already loaded up the memory, the material in memory and the shape in memory. So it can display 10 million copies of something and yet only have the memory usage of 1. And particles is the same thing. Once it generates the particles material has been generated. It doesn't have to think about it from there on in, but it's that initial burst of rain coming out of the sky that is putting the load on your graphics card. The rest of it then is being handled in memory and Unreal. So what they came up with was the ability to use your CPU, your processor on your computer, to generate the first round of particles. Once the particles have been generated, then your graphics card takes over, and it's a whole lot easier on it. But it's that initial burst of particles, it's the big load on your graphics card. So what they have here, and I'm going to, this black bar right here, I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to go to type data. And this is where we can come in and we can do different things with our particle systems. Particle systems are not just raindrops or not just flames. Particle systems can be like you're doing like a motion trail. You want somebody to wave a sword and have what looks like a motion trail come out of the back end of it. That's a particle system. I can do ribbons. I can do meshes. I can actually generate a three-dimensional model. I can do beams, like a light beam. I can do animation. I can have a character animate and then have it look like he's, got an animated trail coming out behind him. Those types of things. But I also have something in here called GPU sprites, which is what I'm going to select. Type data, new GPU sprites. Okay, I got a little warning there. I'll talk about that. There's really nothing I can change on that. Okay, I can blur it out a little bit, and I actually am going to blur it. I'm going to set that blur to 1. It's going to do a little bit of a blur on those drops as they go by the camera. But what it tells you is here, this particle system has no fixed bounding box and contains a GPU emitter. Okay, well, I've created a bounding box. I've set the size of this thing, but what I just need to do is I just need to go in and click one button, and it's going to take care of it. That says, look, those particles are not being emitted throughout the world. They're only in a fixed space. So what I'll do is I'll come up here to bounds, and I'm going to select set fixed bounds, and that warning is going to go away. And if I click this button, you'll see that it just creates this little block in here, and everything is occurring inside of that. I don't need to see that. Okay, but what it's doing now is, as GPU sprites, it is generating the CPU, the processor on my computer, is doing the initial work. The hardest part of particles is the initial generation of them. So the CPU on my computer is doing it. If you've got a graphics adapter on your laptop, your CPU is doing all the work anyway. So rather than say, look, let's convert that to memory, it takes a tremendous amount of memory to create those particles. Your graphics adapter, what it does is, if your graphics adapter doesn't have enough built onboard memory to do something, it pulls away from your random access memory, which is the memory you have to do things. It pulls away from that to generate the graphics power necessary to do something, and then what you end up with is a lag, and if you go to move your mouse, nothing seems to work because you don't have enough memory left on your computer to do it. So what this does is that says that if you don't have a graphics card adapter, or if you have a graphics card adapter or you don't have a full-size graphics card in your laptop or tower, then what we'll do is we'll put the load of the creation on the processor itself. So your processor fires the first burst, and then from there on in, your graphics card or your graphics adapter takes over. The work has been done. The load has really been processed already, so it's much easier, and it's a really nice feature, and we use this a lot up here. In fact, I use it whenever possible, just because it allows me to generate more particles, because it's only that initial burst, and once that burst is done, then I'm off and running. So that's kind of what I want to do. So that's my raindrops. My raindrops are in my world there. If I look at them and see, where's my particle system? Boom, there it is. I pulled it up in the air. Okay. And if I come back down in here and I play the game, I've got raindrops coming by me, and I'm real happy. I might go back up there and lower that down just a little bit. I'm getting some particles come by me, but I think I'd like to maybe lower that just a little bit. Yeah, I like to see them coming by me like that. It's a little bit easier. And I got particles. They were coming by before. They're a little bit more there. So that's the first step. Get out of that. That's the first step. What we're going to do in the second part of this video is I'm going to come back and I'm going to add in the little rain splashes.